Today is September 22nd, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. In case you're not aware, though I've spoken about it a couple times, I'm currently studying a course at Harvard titled The Creation of the Constitution. And it's a study of the development of the Constitution, obviously, but the documents that were influential at the time that revealed to us what was going on intellectually in America as the Constitution was drafted, as it was debated after it was drafted, and ultimately as it was ratified. As a classicist who studied ancient history, I never spent much time in modern history or American history. And I'm thankful that I didn't, because being able to take up this study at this point in my life, where I'm 48 years old, I've raised children, I've owned a business, I've worked in education for over 20 years and so on. It's so good to be able to read this with the education that I have, with the experience that I have, and so on. I'm so thankful that I am able to enter into this study fresh, as it were. Part of my study, I have to write a book review, and I had to select from a number of books that were presented to us. And I chose a book by a history professor and scholar from MIT, Dr. Pauline Meyer, and she wrote a book titled Ratification: The People Debate the Constitution, and it covers the period from 1787 to 1788. That is after the Constitution was originally drafted, the period between the drafting of the Constitution and the ratification of the Constitution. And she narrates in this book, which is about 500 pages long. Let's see, as of tonight, I'm about 400 pages in. She narrates in this book the debates that took place in the 13 states as the Constitution was drafted and then presented to the states for ratification. For the Constitution to be established, 9 of the 13 states had to ratify it or approve it. And this was very controversial because there was already a government established after the Revolution, which we might call the Confederation, right? The organization of the 13 states according to the Articles of Confederation. And yet, leading men in America got together in Philadelphia and drafted a completely new form of government, which we call the Constitution today. And you can imagine you had an existing system that was composed of 13 independent states that were loosely organized into something of a confederacy or a federation. And that life was already established in America, but there were men who wanted something better. There were men who saw the problems that were being revealed as the Americans gained experience under the Articles of Confederation, and they knew that something had to be done. These included men like George Washington, George Mason, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Patrick Henry, all of these famous American founding fathers. They realized that something had to be done, and there was strong disagreement on what it was that needed to be done. And these men represented very different groups in society. There were Puritans in the Northeast, there were Quakers in Pennsylvania, there were Anglicans in places like Virginia, there were Catholics in Maryland. These were very different people. these were very different men representing very different groups in this young American society. And they had to come together and discuss politics. They had to establish a system of government. And they had ambitions for this government, and it was very uncertain how those ambitions were to be carried out, or fulfilled, I should say. And this was the content and focus of this debate. And you can imagine what a significant debate it was. Such incomprehensible implications, so much pressure on these men like James Madison, for example, who had a number of nervous breakdowns during this period. This was a stressful time and very difficult, very contentious debates with great consequences, and all of the men involved understood this. But what has amazed me as I've read this book, and this study has been emotional for me, to tell you the truth, because I grew up in a very patriotic community in central New Jersey. I went to Washington School as an elementary school student named after George Washington, and then I went to Thomas Jefferson Middle School. I grew up in a very patriotic community, and I loved America as a kid. I loved singing patriotic songs. I loved parades. I loved the Pledge of Allegiance. I loved going to sporting events and singing the Star-Spangled Banner. I loved America as a kid growing up. I was very proud to be American, and I have to admit that as I grew up, that early love of America faded, especially with my conversion to Christianity, because my thoughts and my concerns were just so taken up with Christianity that I didn't think much about America anymore. I didn't think much about politics at all anymore. And I really haven't thought about these subjects very much until I took up this course and started to really enjoy the opportunity to dig in, to read, and to work through many of the primary sources from the 18th century, starting with Montesquieu's Spirit of Laws and working through works like Thomas Paine's Common Sense and John Adams' Thoughts on Government, reading the constitutions of a number of the different states that were made before the federal constitution was drafted, and just having this opportunity to soak in all of this stuff at this point in my life, it's been very, very refreshing and helpful. But what has amazed me about it is the virtue of the Founding Fathers and just how shockingly different the spirit of the political discussion was from what it is today. And again, I'm not very political. I don't get into the political controversies today. I tend to keep political views private, but to see the difference between the spirit of public discourse with respect to politics today and compare that to the debates of the period of the ratification has just been amazing to me. And I said before, it's been somewhat emotional just because of how beautiful the culture of 18th century America was, especially among the Founding Fathers, how respectful, how patient and disciplined and wise the men were. And I'd like to talk about it a little bit because I'd like to try and help myself and hopefully help others as well to have a better approach to politics and think about these things rightly by considering and imitating the example set for us by the by the founding fathers of America. What's clear about the men in the 18th century was that they had an idea of what government was for that they all agreed on. And they also had a sense of dangers that they faced that they all agreed on. The debate was really about what needed to be done in order to avoid those dangers, but simultaneously fulfill the ends of government. I'm sure you're familiar with the Declaration of Independence and its talk about the natural rights that men enjoy to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the fundamental idea of government was that government existed to promote those rights, to protect and preserve those rights. The right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to the pursuit of happiness. And so the question that really puzzled those men at that time was, how can we establish some sort of central government and give it power without having to sacrifice our liberties? That was the real challenge. The reason why they needed to establish a central government and give it power was because after the revolution, when the monarchy had been thrown off from America, over time, the spirit of anarchy started to develop, and there were rebellions, and there were fights, and there were instances of violence and chaos, and the Americans could see that this was slowly degenerating into anarchy, and there was no real government, especially at any kind of national level, to establish order and maintain peace. It wasn't safe. It was becoming unsafe to live in America. And the founding fathers knew that. They knew they had to establish a central government, and they knew that they had to give it power, but they had to figure out how to protect the liberties of the Americans at the same time, and that's what the debate was about. But what's important is that those men had a shared sense of what was important and a shared sense of what threatened what was important. And that's what united them. What united those men was a sense of what was important and what threatened what was important. They understood that everything else was secondary. They understood that all the other issues were secondary. What was primary were the liberties, or I should say the rights of the citizens, and those things that were endangering those rights. They had to come up with a solution, and they disagreed very strongly on what the solution might be. Some men believed that a strong federal government needed to be established, and they disagreed about what that government should look like. For example, in Pennsylvania, they believed that there should be a single legislative assembly with representatives elected by the people, and that assembly, that single assembly, which was comparable to the House of Representatives today, but at the state level, that single assembly would be the government. And there were others, like John Adams, who said, no, this would never work. There's no way that a single assembly can conduct the affairs of government, because people are corrupt, and when they get into power, they'll use that power for their own benefit. And what are the people going to supervise the representatives? If the people are going to do that, what's the point of having representatives? And so John Adams argued in his work titled Thoughts on Government that a system of government needed to be established that basically governed itself through checks and balances, which we're familiar with today. But that was a new idea, or I shouldn't say new idea, but a developing idea at that time, that the government should be arranged so that different parts of the government keep each other in check. And whereas in Pennsylvania, they established a constitution for the state based on that single assembly model, in Massachusetts, John Adams and the men up in New England established a system of what was called a balanced or divided government that was really sort of like a rough draft of what would eventually become the American federal government. These men disagreed very strongly on these things, and there were other men who hated the whole idea of a federal government and really wanted to just strengthen the Articles of Confederation, improve them, amend them, and so on. And so we had at least three different groups, very significant, debating at the time whether the Confederacy that had been established should simply be improved, or whether a completely new form of government should be established and what that government should look like. And these were very significant disagreements. And these men were very committed to their convictions. They were accustomed to a spirit of liberty and freedom of speech and of conscience. These are men who had just come out of a revolution and war, and they weren't ready to just hand over things that they had fought for. The states were very different. The 13 states had significant differences in terms of who lived in the states, what the religious majority was, and the influential religion, as it was in each state. These were very different peoples. These were very different communities. And when it came to this question of the Constitution, they strongly disagreed. A man like George Washington or James Madison or Alexander Hamilton, they were called Federalists, and they were for the Constitution. But other men like Patrick Henry and George Clinton in New York, they were called anti-federalists, and they didn't believe that the Constitution was the solution. And these were very intelligent, very eloquent, very influential, very courageous men. And when it was time to debate the Constitution, these men had to go to battle against each other. And these debates of the period of the ratification are famous because some of the greatest men in American history argued with each other face to face in these conventions that met to discuss and vote on the Constitution. But as I said, what's amazing is how these men were able to respect the common good and respect democracy as a form of government, to respect each other's freedom of speech, to hear each other, to argue vehemently with each other and exhaustively for days and days, if not weeks, if not months, but at the same time always respecting each other's position, listening carefully to each other's arguments, and ultimately coming to agreement for the good of the nation. Their ability to compromise is so amazing to read about because this is completely absent from popular politics in American society. we can see, if we look at the discussions on social media, for example, and on the news, we can see that the extreme right and the extreme left enjoy fighting with each other. They hate each other. They would like for their opposing parties to disappear. They'd like them to die. And none of that was present in the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers were men who had fought a war together. They were men who loved each other as fellow Americans, and yet at the same time had no problem tearing each other apart in debates for the good of the country. And like I said, their ability to listen to each other, to hear each other's arguments and objections, to be willing to admit when their opponent's arguments were convincing, their ability to compromise and find solutions that made different groups capable of coming to agreement on more important issues. It's just amazing. It's beautiful. It's overwhelming, especially when you're used to the filth and nonsense that we have to listen to and hopefully not participate in modern America, because that's not what early America was like. In order for us to have peace in politics, there's a few things that I've learned that we've really got to get into our heads. First of all, we have to realize that we're not responsible to impose Christianity upon our neighbors. We're not responsible for that. We're not responsible to make Christianity the law of the land. We're not responsible to kill the infidels and establish our Christian religious law, imposing it by force upon our. We're not responsible to do that. We're not asked to do that by God. It's not God's will for us to do that. Christ commanded us to go into the world and make disciples, and that was to be done by preaching the gospel, not by force, not by violence, not by obnoxious political quarreling. It's to be done peaceably. It's to be done patiently and humbly. I should say justly as well. And what we see people doing, what we see Christians doing on the far right and on the left, is we see them not seeking peace among their neighbors. We're not seeking the common good. We're not seeking to make life better than it is. We're just fighting to win. We're fighting to win, and we consider anything else, anything other than victory, to be a loss and to be unacceptable. And this was not the spirit of the Founding Fathers. I'll give you an example. Down in the South, in states like Georgia and South Carolina, slavery was common. I forget what the number was, but I think it was 2/3 of the population were slaves. I think that's right. I'd have to check it, but something crazy like that. More than half of the population were slaves in some places. And the economy was dependent upon slaves in the far South. The northern states knew that Georgia and South Carolina couldn't just end slavery. And so what they did was they came to a compromise. It was very clear, even in the 1780s, that Americans did not want slavery to continue. This idea that Americans loved slavery and then, somehow they were forced to change their mind is completely false. Slavery was despised throughout America, and there were a couple places, mainly in the South, that had become so dependent on slavery that even though they might admit that it was to be abolished, there was going to need to be a process by which it was abolished. And so when the Constitution was drafted, in order to make it possible for Georgia and South Carolina to accept the Constitution allowed Georgia and South Carolina to continue as they were temporarily, and that at a later time the question of slavery would be taken up. And that concession was made to Georgia and South Carolina to allow them to ratify the Constitution. And that was a radical compromise. I mean, that was a compromise that you can imagine the men who drafted the Constitution, they had to take some real heat for including that. And yet, it was for the sake of establishing unity and peace and safety that temporary concessions had to be made. And the men who hated slavery and wanted to abolish it, they had to understand and accept the reality that it was not going to be abolished overnight. That the what of politics has to take into consideration also the question of the when in politics. And the Founding Fathers, they were just amazing in their ability to do these things. And you can just see that we don't think like them. A very clear example is abortion. If we compare abortion and slavery as two great evils in our society, we see the conservatives taking an all or nothing position and refusing to budge. And we can see how different that is from the position that was taken on an offensive subject like slavery at the time of the Constitution, and how the Founding Fathers didn't act like the modern conservatives do on issues that were very serious to them, because there were other more serious questions for government that had to come first. And even as I say that, I'm sure that some people will start arguing there's nothing that comes before the life of an unborn child. And you can see the extremism that leads to this all or nothing position, which actually causes the pro-life movement to fail. Whereas the Founding Fathers were able to succeed by their willingness to compromise and pursue their ideals one step at a time. Very few conservatives are willing to work one step at a time. And this is why ultimately they lose many supporters, because there are millions and millions of Americans who don't like abortion, but at the same time they recognize the problems in our society that make it impossible to just end abortion overnight. It's just not realistic. And so a step-by-step solution, an incremental pursuit of the elimination of abortion, would be more American if we're considering the Founding Fathers as the models of what it means to be American. There are essential needs that we have as a people that the Constitution was designed to provide for. And what's happening today is that we're allowing isolated disputes that the American people disagree on to really undermine the government that unites us. And people think that this is just, something that's funny or silly. Conservatives, communicate with disrespectful memes, just mocking their opponents. And the Founding Fathers didn't act like that. They respected their opponents as fellow Americans, and they sought together to pursue the common good to the satisfaction of as many as possible. They didn't simply wrestle over whose side was going to win or whose will was going to be done. They understood that they had to compromise. They had to make deals with one another, and they had to pursue their ideals incrementally, one step at a time. And they respected each other, as I said. The respect they have for one another was incredible, and I'll give you another example. One of the most famous orators at the time of the ratification was Patrick Henry, who was in Virginia. You know Patrick Henry because he famously said, "Give me liberty or give me death." Well, that's the kind of speaker he was. He was a very powerful anti-federalist. He was opposed to the Constitution, violently opposed. He was such a powerful speaker that the greatest defenders of the Constitution could barely resist his oratory. Men like James Madison had to personally take up the arguments against Patrick Henry because he was so influential, and he was an anti-federalist again. The problem for Henry was that the other states were already ratifying the Constitution, and reports that the Constitution was being ratified in the other states began to reach Virginia, and so Patrick Henry really found himself fighting against all of the states and not just his opponents in Virginia. And eventually the Federalists won in Virginia, and Virginia ratified the Constitution. But what's impressive is that Patrick Henry greatly disliked the Constitution and believed it was terrible. He hated it. There's no question he hated it and would do anything he could to have it rejected by the people of Virginia. But when he realized that there was no way for him to win and that it was going to be ratified, his response and reaction to it is just so beautiful and so exemplary of how those men lived and thought. He said, "I'm going to continue to argue against the Constitution as it is, but I'm going to do so in a respectful American way. I'm not going to call men to rebel against it. I'm not going to disobey it or defy it. I'm going to accept it as the law of the land. I'm going to respect the decision of the people, and I'm going to argue against it for its amendment after it's ratified." And Patrick Henry both rejected and accepted the Constitution. And that's what I think modern Americans can't grasp. We can't grasp, for all of our talk, we can't grasp the reality that in a democratic society you have to simultaneously submit to the will of the people and yet continue to exercise your freedom to argue for change. Patrick Henry is an example of one who wanted change and yet was committed out of love for his fellow Americans to seek it in a civil manner. Really beautiful spirit. So we see that among the founding fathers, and where do we see that today? I really don't know where we see anything like that today. It's either men are just, or they seem to be, careless and compromising without any limit, or they're completely uncompromising. Everything they say is blood and fire and destruction and apocalyptic, and there's just no place for compromise, anything other than their opinion justifies complete despising and mockery and slander and disrespect and hatred. That just wasn't the spirit in early America. Now, I said before, as Christians, we're sent into the world to make disciples, and Jesus tells us that we're to be the salt of the earth. The salt doesn't take over the dish. The salt doesn't replace the food. The salt doesn't go into the pot and seek to turn the pot's contents into salt. The salt simply influences the dish, makes it more salty. Jesus says that if the salt doesn't do that, if the salt no longer influences the dish and causes it to become more salty, it's good for nothing. And we can see that there are many today who claim to be Christian, but they are not like salt. They don't influence the world for good. And yet at the same time, the image of salt shows us that it's a patient, incremental improvement. And I think modern Christians have a hard time accepting this, that we're simply to try to influence things in a tactful and civil way as Christians, patiently, prayerfully. And we need to not allow ourselves to be scrupulous and think that living in an unbelieving community in some way makes us culpable for the unbelief or for the sin of that community. I think that's scrupulosity to associate the evil in our society or our living in the presence of it with some kind of approval of it. And that's not true. And the evidence that that's not true of us is influence that we can point to where, in ways that we're capable of, we influence things towards God's will. We make it salty as much as we can. And that's really the work of the laity in America, is to simply seek to constantly provide some Christian influence in everything we do, but understand at the same time that society is made up of hundreds of millions of non-Christians who are paying taxes and who have a right to be here, who are protected by the same laws that we are. And we have to respect that reality. And that's a tough pill to swallow, I'll admit it. That we have to respect the reality that half of the country in the next presidential election, assuming we're either Republicans or Democrats, half of the country is going to vote against our opinion. And we have to realize that. Even if we win an election, the goal is not to simply spitefully impress our will by force upon a population where half of the people don't want our will. That's just not respectful. It's really not democratic. It doesn't respect the disagreement. It doesn't respect the will of the people. Just because we win a majority doesn't mean we have the right to spitefully and disrespectfully impose our will on half of our neighbors. And I think we have to learn not to think like that. And we can think like that if we separate secular politics from our own personal religion. Some people complain about the separation of church and state, but I think it's really essential for there to be peace, because we have to respect the fact that our fellow citizens are not believers, and they shouldn't be expected to act like believers. If we really are concerned about their condition, we should be praying for them, evangelizing them, and modeling an exemplary Christian life that's attractive. We should be seeking to draw them to Christ, primarily by the example of the happiness of our life. Certainly not by scoffing at them or being disrespectful or mocking them, trying to humiliate them, and so on. But seeking to gain their trust and show them how sincere we are, and introduce them to a superior system of beliefs and morals and even prayers. What we offer them should be superior to what they have, and they should, after some time, realize that. That should be our goal. If we're really concerned about our country and our nation, we would devote everything we have to prayer and evangelization. And so we have to respect the presence of unbelievers and the fact that we have to live among them. We have to respect the democratic process. We have to respect what it allows us to do and what it doesn't allow us to do. We have to respect the democratic process and realize that just because we may be allowed to do something, it doesn't mean that we should do it. A good example of this is the mockery of your opponents in political discussions. The disrespectful memes and videos and posts on social media, mockery, making fun of Joe Biden because he's suffering from dementia. That's just not civil. The founding fathers would never do that. And yet that's normal now. The use of foul language, I see foul language among conservative, supposedly Christian people all the time because they feel that it's justified because their opponents are the scum of the earth. And that's just not an American disposition. We respect our neighbors because they're Americans. We respect them because we need a government. We need social order. We need peace and safety in order to pursue happiness and live in tranquility, to make a living, to raise our children, to practice our religion, and so on. And the only way that there can be tranquility is if we, to a degree, leave each other alone, respect each other's freedoms, the freedom to speak, freedom to worship, and so on. And many Christians don't seem to be able to live like that, to have peace, to see your neighbor across the street who may practice a different religion and be able to wave to him in the morning. That wave to your neighbor, that's America. That's really what it means to be an American. Not to agree with the neighbor, but to respect the neighbor's right to freedom, to worship and to study and to think and to pray and to speak and to argue in a tactful way, because we have other things to do as well. We have to earn a living, we have to provide for our families, on and on. And I think this is what Pope Francis is always urging upon us as he talks about entering into dialogue and having peace for the sake of dialogue. We have to respect each other as physical, natural, rational human beings and realize that there should be peace among us just as men. And secondarily, there should be peace among us as Americans. And where we disagree on religion, we have to consider those things carefully and seek to discuss them and hopefully to draw others closer to what is true. But at the same time, we've got to respect those other aspects of our lives and help one another. We've got to respect that our neighbors need to earn a living, respect that our neighbors are raising children, respect that our neighbors don't agree with us, but that doesn't mean we can't live next door to each other in peace. And if we can live in peace, well, then we have the setting for good, careful, respectful discussion. And that's a culture that the founding fathers had established very strongly. There was a healthy environment where men could stand and look each other in the eye and argue vehemently against each other and shake hands at the end. I don't think we have that spirit today. We're happy to be divided. We're happy to be fighting. We're happy to watch people's businesses collapse. You know, you'll hear people say, go woke, go broke, and they'll almost celebrate that like it's something funny, but it's not funny. It's not funny for someone to lose a business or to lose a job. We shouldn't seek that. We should seek and we should desire our neighbors' prosperity and happiness and health and safety. And we should disagree and discuss our disagreements in a way that doesn't take away from those other aspects of life. And just imagine if we lived like that, how our neighbors would respect us when they saw that kind of self-control and respect and humility in the way we speak to them, in the way we act towards them and their families and their cultures, seeking to be salt, but realizing at the same time that it's not just about what, but also about when and how. Because we have to ask ourselves, am I acting out of a sincere charity towards my neighbor? Am I sincerely concerned about his happiness? Or am I arguing with him or mocking him for some other reason, like I want to impress my friends? That's really not Christianity. So the first thing we've got to realize is if our efforts to discuss things aren't really inspired by a true and sincere love for the other person, a desire for the other person's happiness, then it's not evangelization. It's the proselytization that Pope Francis warns us about. It's insincere. It's not the real thing. It's a counterfeit. And the reason why sincere Christians who are salt of the earth can live in peace with their neighbor is because they truly love their neighbor and they want their neighbor to be happy. They want their neighbor to be successful and safe. They want their neighbor to enjoy freedom and so on. And so they pursue the evangelization of their neighbor, which is another act of mercy, but they do so in a way that respects all the other acts of mercy. And there are just many, I would say most Christians that we hear in the course of a day on social media and the news who clearly do not sincerely love their neighbor, but are just looking to defeat them in an argument or embarrass them and then go high-five their friends, leaving this person on the outside. That's not sincere evangelization. And I think that's what Pope Francis is always warning about. That wasn't the spirit of the Americans. They truly loved each other. They were jealous for each other's happiness and liberty. And yet at the same time, they were able to argue with each other about details of the political decisions that needed to be made, while always maintaining a respect for the dignity of the other men. You'll notice if you ever watch C-SPAN, when they have a debate in Congress, you'll notice that the senators or the representatives won't refer to each other by name. They won't say, or they shouldn't say, I should say, they shouldn't refer to each other by name, but they'll refer to themselves as the gentleman from South Carolina, and so on. That's a habit that was established in early America, which shows the respect that the men have for each other, that they make it clear that I'm not arguing against a man. This isn't a personal thing. It's not me against this man. It's not James Madison against Patrick Henry. It's these two ideas that are being debated. And to make this clear, they didn't refer to each other by name when they debated. They referred to each other in some other way. There was respect for the opponent because he was an American. And I'm sure that it was easier to feel like that because they were coming out of a war that they had fought together and collaborated in. They were very conscious of that war, which is why George Washington was elected first president, the general of the Continental Army. And maybe it's just difficult for us to get along because we haven't had to fight together for something. We haven't had to fight for our basic rights. And we take life for granted. We take all of the good things we have for granted, and we really aren't careful to maintain peace among each other. So to wrap this up, I think I've made the point pretty clear, and I really encourage you to study the period of the ratification and the debates that took place. This book I mentioned by Pauline Maier, Ratification, I can't recommend it strongly enough. It is so beautifully written, so helpful. I admit that today when I was reading it and I read the section where Virginia votes to ratify the Constitution and the people all begin to celebrate, it was emotionally overwhelming. It's such a beautiful story. Such a beautiful story. It made me so proud to be an American. Just reminded me of the patriotism I grew up with, and then watching the ratification debates continue and move to the remaining states. It's just beautiful. It's a beautiful history, and I say that as someone who's studied history for 25 years. I've written a whole history course. To be able to go through this history of the ratification debates has just been so moving to me, and it's made me so proud to be an American. But at the same time, it's been very distressful because I can see how far we've fallen as a society from that civility and respect for fellow Americans. The political discussions today are just disgusting, and what I think we can do as a first step is identify the people who just make a living off of stirring up this hatred among Americans. You know, there are social media figures that are just, they really do nothing but disrespect and dishonor and slander and make people hate other people. And that's just not American. That's not how America works. In America, we understand that we disagree. We compromise for the sake of peace so that we can keep the core ends of government in place, and we commit to work incrementally to resolve the issues we disagree on. That's why we have a constitution that allows amendments. It's an incremental movement together from worse to better. Not from worse to perfect, but from worse to better, to less worse. And we have to accept that that incremental development is how democracy works. And you may have to live for 4 years under a president that you didn't vote for, but that's how democracy works. You may have to submit to a law or a regulation that your party didn't support, but that's how democracy works. And we have to prove ourselves as true citizens of America by respecting our opponent when we lose. We also need to respect our opponent when we win, and realize that just because we win an election doesn't mean we have the right to insult and offend our opponents, who we know are very numerous. And so we've got to think about how we behave politically. And I think we have to really learn to distance ourselves from the people who mock other Americans, who promote division, who promote disrespect, and who also make us miserable because we're just constantly flooded with negativity and criticism and nastiness and videos and who knows what collected from all over the internet, just to constantly make us unhappy, frustrated, vexed, angry, hateful, and so on. We need to learn to turn those people off, because that does not cultivate the spirit that makes America great. And I think we can do that. I think it's a good challenge for us. I think as Catholics, we can certainly do that. We have an example in the church of an institution that develops incrementally, that lives in peace, that recognizes diversity, that respects differences, that focuses on the main thing, and so on. I think if anyone can live according to the American ideal, it's Catholics. But we need to take leadership in this and be good examples, rather than justify our disrespectful behavior by simply saying that other people do it. That's not a Christian response. So that's been the effect of my reading lately. I just have been so impressed by the Founding Fathers. I'm so thankful to have the opportunity to study this to the degree that I'm studying it with just a wonderful course and great classmates, a great professor, and a great book, not to mention all the primary source documents we're studying, but this one book that I've taken up to read. I recommend it. It's a long read. It's 22 or 23 hours worth of reading, but you can get an audiobook version of it. That's how I actually listen to it. I listen to it for 2 hours a day, I guess, when I go for my evening walk. Just listen to it. Just listen to the history and learn it. And it's been awesome. I can't even express how much I enjoy learning about this history, the history of the ratification of the Constitution. It's been very enlightening to me. It's been very upsetting in the sense of seeing how things have degenerated today, but it's also inspiring because I can see that it's something that we can fix, and we need to fix it. We need to recover this spirit of respectful debating against and with our neighbors, seeking to move from worse to better, but to respect the reality that it's going to be incremental, and we need to live together in peace in the meantime, while we continue arguing as friends, as fellow Americans, That's a real challenge that takes virtue, and Christians should be able to lead and model that virtue. So I've challenged myself with that as I've been working through these studies, challenged myself with learning how to maintain my convictions, maintain my own personality, maintain my own beliefs and habits and practices, but at the same time handle them in a way that's respectful for the sake, just to be honest, for the sake of attracting my neighbors to my position, not by disrespectful arguments, but by friendship and example and patience. So I hope that that's helpful. I don't talk about politics much, but it's because I really haven't had the opportunity to spend much time immersed in quality political studies and discussion, and I've had that opportunity recently, and I've really been blessed by it. And so I hope that we can improve the way we speak to people we disagree with, and just realize that we're salt. We influence the food. We don't replace it. We don't destroy it. We don't remove it from the pot. We influence it. We make it more salty. And I think if we can understand that that's how evangelization works, we can live as Americans in peace with neighbors who disagree with us and don't share our views or practices or desires. We can live together, argue with each other, disagree, but at the same time enjoy peaceful relations as a community. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. God bless.